All right, go ahead, Rama. So welcome to the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights webinar, From the Arab Revolt to the Intifadas to BDS, More than 100 Years of Palestinian Resistance. My name is Anna Balzer, and I'm Director of Organizing and Advocacy at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. We're really excited to host this webinar today with three amazing panelists and at a particularly crucial time. This webinar comes on the heels of U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and of plans to move the U.S. Embassy to Tel Aviv from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, flying in the face of international law and legitimizing ongoing illegal colonization of Palestine by Israel. Palestinians have been resisting this colonization for more than a century in very powerful, creative ways, from which we have a lot to learn today as we work together to overcome racism and oppression in the U.S. and around the world. And much of the history of the Palestinian struggle for justice and freedom is unknown to a lot of us in the U.S., especially given the role of corporate media in choosing what Palestinian resistance to cover or not cover, and how. So today our guests will be discussing the long and dynamic legacy of Palestinian resistance, how it advances today, and where we go from here. Our first of three speakers is Dr. Mazen Qumsiya, whose books include Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment, which chronicles the diverse methods and stages of the Palestinian struggle over more than a century, including many extraordinary, uplifting stories, some of them very surprising. I remember reading his book and just being incredibly uplifted and inspired by the stories I'd never heard. And when we actually first planned today's webinar, it was to commemorate the 30th anniversary of what some of us were calling the first Intifada, as it is commonly known. But Mazen actually corrected me that, in fact, the 1987 Intifada was just one of more than a dozen Palestinian uprisings up to that point, many of them less well known, but just as inspiring. So welcome to you, Mazen.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for organizing this, and welcome to everybody who's listening. I may, a little bit later, turn off the video because the internet here is weak, and if the video is on, it make it cut off in terms of the audio. But anyway, I was thinking about what to say at this junction in history, and we just came back from the Christmas lighting tree in Beit Sahur. I live in the shepherd's field, where the shepherds heard the angels sing and went up to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, according to Christian tradition. And if the biblical stories are read as factual events of history, one would wonder how much similarities we have today with those events of 2,000 years ago, when we also had a foreign occupation and we had the resistance and so on. Palestine is actually, I say, is both cursed and blessed in many ways. We're blessed in being part of the Fertile Crescent, where humans first developed agriculture, domesticated plants and animals, and then, of course, being geographically located at the juncture of Eurasia with Africa is a very important transport route. This is where also first human civilizations happened in the Fertile Crescent. Even bird migrations pass through Palestine. 500 million birds pass through Palestine on annual migration from Europe to Africa. So in many ways, we are lucky in being born and raised in this country, but we are also unlucky in being born in this period of human history, where, as you pointed out, for over 100 years, we had a conflict and we had a resistance to this conflict. So this brings me to the issue of the conflict, and I want to say, as both a biologist and a medical geneticist, For me, it's important to understand the etiology of this conflict. What actually caused it, where it starts. And what I find is when we look at this in an objective scientific way, if you want, just like looking at a patient, when I examine a patient, I need to find out what history happened with that patient, a patient history, and then make a right diagnosis before we can offer therapies, let alone make a prognosis or tell the patient your likelihood of cure is such and such. And I don't want to make this a history lesson, but if we follow the patient history in this case, we had the first Zionist colonies in Palestine in 1880, the first two Zionist colonies in Palestine. So we had 137 years now of colonial impact on Palestine. Notice I use Zionist colonies, not Jewish settlements or anything like that, because we had native Jews here, of course, and they lived here among us, a minority of 3%, and they were native as much as Palestinian Christian and Palestinian Muslims. But there was this idea called Zionism, which is an idea to take this country that's 97% not Jewish and make it the Jewish state of Israel. And this is where it started, where, if you want, the first symptoms started to arise. And the first uprising we had is in 1881, and so on and so forth. The bottom line, if we go over all these periodic historical events, we find that the net result is now obvious. There are 12.5 million Palestinians in the world. 7.5 million of us are refugees or displaced people, and the rest, like me, who live here in cantons or Bantustans, like the Bethlehem ghetto and the Ramallah ghetto and the Gaza ghetto, where we live basically in a very precarious lives. At any moment, homes are demolished, people are killed, ethnic cleansing still ongoing, and so forth. So what is the diagnosis, basically, based on this very brief history? The diagnosis is very obvious. We have a colonial, anti-colonial struggle, and colonial, anti-colonial struggles are actually, this diagnosis, not such a bad, horrible diagnosis, because just about every country on earth has lived through it, either as colonizers or as colonized country. And what's the outcome of colonization, anti-colonization struggles? There are one of three possible scenarios for this patient, if you want, or potential outcomes. One outcome is the Algerian model, which is the colonizers lose and the natives win. And in that case, 1 million Algerian lives were lost, and 1 million French colonizers packed their bags and went to France. That's one scenario, very unlikely, very rare in human history. The second scenario is a little more common, but still rare, and that is for the colonizers to wipe out the natives to a point to leave such few numbers of them that they are manageable. That's genocide, like in Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, United States to a large extent. But again, you can count a few countries like that, so it's not very common. The third scenario is the most common scenario, and it's found in places like South America, Central America, Canada, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, etc., and also in South Africa and many other places, which is that the colonizers and the colonized live in one country. These are the potential three outcomes. There is no fourth outcome. Never happened in history that there's a fourth outcome for this kind of struggle. So we are now looking at the third outcome, because that's the most common outcome, and that's the outcome that we Palestinians have called for since that first uprising of 1881. Our demands have always been the same, that we do not reject immigration. We welcomed immigrants like the Armenians, the Druze, the Circassians, etc. We have no problem with immigrants, and people can live here in equality and justice for all people. This is what we have called for. Now, this brings us to the issue. So this is the, if you want a prognosis, the most likely prognosis. It's then at what is the therapy, if you want. How do we do that prognosis in the shortest period of time with the minimal amount of suffering for this patient, if you want. And what we find is very obvious, that the resistance is a key force of this. Just like your immune system resists, the people resist. And so Palestinian resistance is going to be critical in this. And I wrote a book, as you pointed out, on popular resistance in Palestine, a history of hope and empowerment, very inspiring stories of resistance. I don't have much time to go through them, but you can read about them in my book or on my website, which is kumsiya.org. I even have my whole book, Sharing the Land of Canaan, up on that website, so people don't have to buy it. And it's also available in many languages. Now, the question is, what about current events? And with current events, what we have is basically a situation where people are suffering on a daily basis, home demolitions, people being killed, people ethnically cleansed, etc. The question is, how can we speed up this process of arriving at the outcome that's inevitable? When Trump declared Jerusalem capital of Israel for the first time, a sitting president says it while in office, that Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish people also, not even Israel, which is ridiculous, of course, has never been the capital of the Jewish people, so to speak, because Judaism is a religion like any other religion, and of course, American Jews are Jews like anybody else, like American Christians and American Muslims, and their capital is the capital of the country where they live. And so this is the reality that we have to contend with. But I was thinking about Trump's statement, and I was thinking that maybe he is helping us accelerate the inevitable, which is to arrive at that outcome that I mentioned is the third outcome, because obviously the illusion and delusion of a two-state solution is no longer in the cards and has never really been in the cards, because, as I said, we have never had a fourth scenario for a anti-colonial struggle, whatever that scenario is, 2 states or 5 states or whatever. So basically, Trump is accelerating the process by inflaming the people to resist more, and we have had the resistance. Unfortunately, the resistance also carries a price, and we had at least 4 so far martyrs and hundreds injured in this latest mini uprising that we had following Trump's decision. So this leads me to my final couple of remarks I want to make about how we human beings should react and what our responsibility is. Making a diagnosis is important, the right diagnosis, not getting confused by the symptoms. If you make the diagnosis being one of the symptoms, whatever that symptom is, let's say the Israeli colonies in the West Bank here that are around me here in Bethlehem, or the wall that Israel is building, or the violence, or Jerusalem contestation, or whatever. If we make one of those symptoms being the underlying diagnosis, we can apply the wrong therapy. If I have cancer and I have a skin rash and I put a cream on it, It may make me feel better, but ultimately it's not going to help me. So I think, for the audience listening, getting well informed is very, very important, because then you make the right diagnosis and then everything makes sense. Every aspect of what's going on makes sense. When I tell the story, for example, about my village here in Beit Sahur, where we smuggled some cows because Israel prevented us from having cows, and they still do, by the way, as military orders that Palestinians can't own milking cows. And we smuggled some cows, and Israeli military started a military operation called Operation Hunt Cow. If you think about it, just by itself, this doesn't make sense. But if you make the right diagnosis of colonial anti-colonial struggle, this makes absolute sense. In the same way that the European colonizers have basically butchered millions of buffaloes to deprive the natives of a source of living. So everything starts to make sense when you make the right diagnosis. So why is this struggle so important? This struggle, as Palestinian-Israeli struggle, is not really a Palestinian-Israeli struggle. It is a facet of a deeper issue which is present throughout the world, which is the rich get richer and the poor get poor, and it is time for us, the masses, to rise up and demand equality, justice, human rights, and stop allowing those who run the world, basically, to run the world in a way that's leading to its end, basically, its demise as a world. So it's a collective responsibility. Palestine becomes an issue that's important because it's a very good issue to challenge Western hypocrisy with it. When Western leaders speak about wanting peace or human rights or international law and support this racist apartheid regime here, then this is an issue. And it shows their hypocrisy in the same way that they supported South Africa under apartheid, and then later when apartheid ended, they all claimed that they opposed apartheid. This is why it's important, becomes a very crucial subject, and it's a collective responsibility. And I'm seeing the world rising up, and demonstrations just in the past week. I saw tens of thousands of people from Yemen to Lebanon to Jordan to Chicago to DC, New York, etc. I think people are rising up, and we need more support. We need you to act through many, many ways you can act. I have actually in my last email, which goes out to 60,000 people, I put a link to my website where I have at qumsiyya.org, there's a what to do link right in the front page. There are 70 ways that people can act for peace and justice, and they are acting, and I'm very, very encouraged, and I'm very, very optimistic. I'm optimistic also because trying to create monolithic states, whether a Jewish state or a Christian state or a white state or a Muslim state, is bound to fail because it's against human nature, against even nature in general. Biosystems love diversity. Diversity is strength. Weakness is in attempts to make it monolithic. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions or chat with people if they want to chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mazen, for that really powerful analysis and frame for us to understand what's happening and really contextualize what's happening on the ground now and our role in the international community in supporting justice for Palestinians. Just a reminder that folks can ask questions to Mazen and other speakers using the Q&A feature, the chat function. If you're watching the Facebook live stream, you can comment. By the way, the live stream link is in the chat box, so if folks can share it That's great. So our next speaker is Abdul Rahman Abu Nahil, the Gaza Regional Coordinator for the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS National Committee, the BNC, which coordinates worldwide resistance to Israel's regime through the tactics of BDS. And we're particularly gratified to have Abdul Rahman with us, given that he's working now with a computer on a battery, a light on a battery, given Israel's suffocating restrictions on electricity for the people of Gaza. And we're reminded of the nearly 2 million people who are trapped in Gaza by this humanitarian catastrophe that is being deliberately manufactured and maintained by Israel. So Abdul Rahman will be helping to contextualize BDS in this longer story of Palestinian-led resistance, and to help us in the international community join and uplift BDS activism. After all, we know that today's growing attempts by the Israeli and US governments and others to criminalize and repress BDS campaigning is really a testament to just how powerful these tactics have been in challenging Israel's oppressive apartheid regime. So welcome to you, Abdul Rahman.
Welcome. Thanks, Anna, and thanks US Campaign for Palestinian Rights for organizing this webinar, and hi to everyone who is watching us. It is inspiring to speak about the Intifada amidst the Israeli airstrikes on Gaza and the protests in Palestine and elsewhere against the reckless Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, contravening international law and Palestinian rights. It is a chance to intensify BDS campaign. The Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions BDS movement for Palestinian rights was launched in 2005 by the proudest spectrum of Palestinian political and social and trade union entities inside historic Palestine and in exile. BDS is the latest phase in the ongoing Arab-Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism, enriched by learning from other struggles such as the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights struggle. Boycotts have been used by Palestinians in our struggle against colonialism since at least the 1920s, including the Great Strike in the 1939 and the Intifada in 1987, during which Palestinians created new boycott tactics like the Beit Sahur tax boycott experience, which Dr. Mazen mentioned, and declaring cities like Gaza free of most of Israeli products. The first Intifada began in December 1987 in northern Gaza, Jabalia village and refugee camp, and spread to other cities, villages, and refugee camps across Palestine. Within months, national unified leadership and popular committees were formed to unify resistance, organize, and strategize popular action. Despite the iron fist policy of the brutal Israeli military occupation, including the barbaric Yitzhak Rabin policy of breaking the bonds of Palestinian children and youth to prevent them from throwing stones, Palestinians, political parties, social organizations, and communities in the occupied Palestinian territory organized themselves to lead the Intifada. The Intifada proved practically that a creative, non-violent resistance can challenge Israel's military rule in spite of the horrific weapons and violence of the IOF. Eventually, part of the exiled Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, took over the leadership of the Intifada, turning the struggle on the ground in Palestine into a bargaining chip used at the Madrid conference, then the infamous Oslo Accords. From gaining hope, the Intifada ended in disappointment. Learning from these lessons, the BDS movement for Palestinian rights is led by the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society, the Palestinian BDS National Committee, BNC, which is impressively inclusive of all the main political and social formations, yet is not controlled by one party, faction, or ideology. The PLO political ambition at the time of Intifada or before was a state within the pre-1967 border. For this, the PLO was willing to forfeit the right of return and ignore the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and was largely committed to refraining from challenging the root cause of our injustice, namely Israel's regime of settler colonialism and apartheid. Under the Oslo Accords, they designed the Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor for the occupation, commit to a peace process that has only served to cover ongoing ethnic cleansing and colonization. Oslo also brought normalization between the oppressed and the oppressor to a golden age, but BDS played the most important role after its launch in pushing normalization back to become again an isolated, loose phenomenon. In 1998, merely 5 years after Oslo and 7 years before the BDS call, Edward Said wrote, quote, "At the present moment, the Palestinian question has receded so dramatically in the public mind as to be non-existent. Gone are the academics, the students, the organizations that used to bear a message about dispossession and injustice. An immense void swallows what little is said or done on behalf of a people that has suffered the loss of its land and identity over the past century." End quote. But the Palestinian phoenix never ceases to rise from the apparent ashes. Palestinian people have never stopped resisting the Israeli regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation with creativity, resilience, and inextinguishable hope. After Al-Aqsa Second Intifada in 2000 and Israel's reaction by disproportionate force against Palestinians, in 2005, in the wake of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion declaring the apartheid wall illegal, the vast majority of Palestinian civil society launched the BDS call for Palestinian rights, which aims at isolating Israel as apartheid South Africa was isolated, till it complies with international law by meeting 3 basic demands. 1, ending its 1967 occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. 2nd, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. 3rd, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. BDS has revived the importance and the strategic value of nonviolent resistance by associating it with the 3 rights that address Palestinians everywhere, whether inside historic Palestine or in diaspora, not just in the 1967 occupied territory. It has also revived the value of volunteerism and personal commitment to advance the collective struggle of the Palestinian people, one of the defining characteristics of the Intifada. Though the Intifada showed the world the resilience and the bravery of the Palestinian people as they struggled for their basic rights, it failed to mobilize strategic international pressure on Israel. This allowed Israel to continue with its crimes in crushing the Intifada for years. Learning from this experience, the BDS movement is mobilizing international pressure on Israel by building coalitions with other human rights, injustice, and social movements around the world in order to end international publicity by companies, governments, institutions, artists, and others in Israel's denial of Palestinian rights. We live in the age of social media and very fast exchange of information. Photos, videos, and reports about Israel's crimes are easily spread, bypassing the inherently biased corporate media. BDS has developed strategies and tactics to harness this new technology, making huge leaps in exposing in real time Israeli massacres and war crimes against Palestinians, like in Gaza in the winter of 2008 and 9 and the summer of 2014. For instance, in the Arab world, social media storms have become a useful tool to express support for Palestinian rights through BDS and to fight normalization with Israel when street actions are banned under repressive regimes. The BDS movement is a global Palestinian-led anti-racist and inclusive movement. Intersectionality and coalition building with other struggles is a key part of BDS strategy. BDS demands are based in the international law and a commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This allows BDS and other movements to come together around common targets violating human rights, with G4S being a prime example. In a world where corporate and state actors are often involved in violating human rights of communities around the world. BDS has united the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality with other struggles such as the mutual support between BDS and the movement for Black Lives, as well as joining the worldwide call this year for a world without walls from Palestine to Mexico. The next step should be turning this mutual support into concrete strategic campaigns against corporate criminals who profit from Israeli violations of international law and or violations of human rights in other countries such as G4S. A very positive example of a campaign we are involved in supporting the rights of both Palestinians in Palestine and Black people in the US is the Deadly Exchange campaign led by Jewish Voice for Peace, targeting the Anti-Defamation League for its facilitation of joint training and exchange of oppressive tactics between Israeli and US police and other security forces. Recently, there has been impressive mutual support between BDS and Colombian civil society for the achievement of peace and justice in both countries. In a world of allied regimes of oppression and militarization from the US and Latin America to Africa and Arab world to India and Myanmar, only intersectionality between the struggles of oppressed peoples and marginalized groups can help in creating a better world, more equal, just, and free. Our struggles unite us in the face of fascism, colonialism, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, patriarchy, and all other forms of oppression. The unity of oppressed communities is not a luxury. It's crucial for our common struggles against oppression to succeed. Peace now is a vibrant global movement made up of unions, academic associations, churches, and grassroots movements across the world. More than 12 years since its launch, BDS having a major impact and is effectively challenging international support for Israeli apartheid and land theft. In the US, major churches like the Presbyterian, the United Methodists, and the United Church of Christ and the Mennonites, among others, have divested from Israeli companies and banks. Many academic associations have endorsed the institutional academic boycott. Tens of student unions have endorsed divestment resolutions, and many artists are staying away from Tel Aviv, just as progressive artists had boycotted Sun City in apartheid South Africa. In 2016, Oscar-nominated movie stars didn't take an all-expenses-paid Israeli propaganda trip given to them, and six Super Bowl-winning NFL players refused a similar propaganda trip this year. In Europe, more than 60 cities and regions in the Spanish state have joined the apartheid-free zone initiative in spite of the Israeli lobby's vicious legal warfare to stop it. In the global south, the largest farmers' unions in India, ICAS, representing 16 million farmers, recently endorsed the BDS call. In Latin America, the largest trade union in Brazil, the CUT, representing over 7 million workers, endorsed BDS. And in South Africa, our inspiration, the church councils, trade unions, including COSATU, the largest trade union federation, and many other civil society institutions actively support BDS. Also in the Arab world, G4S has lost important contracts with companies and UN agencies in Jordan and Lebanon, among others. Some of the biggest BDS victories are the withdrawal of multinational corporations like Veolia and Orange from Israel and its colonies, each ending their profiteering from occupation and apartheid after years-long diverse BDS campaigns that took place from the Americas and Europe to the Arab world. These successful campaigns inspire us to intensify and widen the campaigns against HP and G4S till they also end their complicity in the violations of human rights. The more BDS grows and succeeds in pressuring Israel, the more Israel and its allies become more desperate and vicious in attacking BDS. In the US, we can see this backlash in dozens of McCarthyist anti-BDS laws at the state and federal level. As a consequence of one of these laws, the city of Dickinson, Texas, attempted to deprive its citizens from post-Harvey hurricane relief unless they swore not to boycott Israel as part of the aid application. Though well-financed and often supported by powerful pro-Israel lobbies, thanks to the resistance of BDS supporters and allies, these anti-BDS and anti-democratic initiatives are failing to stop us. The European Union, the American Civil Liberties Union in the US, the governments of Sweden, Netherlands, and Ireland, as well as the parliaments of Spain and Switzerland, all have explicitly defended the right to boycott Israel as protected under the right to freedom and of expression and association. Speaking about the ongoing resistance against Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism is very personal for me. My grandparents in Barbara village were among the many Palestinians who took part in the Great Revolution in 1936 to 1939, and the resistance to defend our homes against the Zionist militias during the ethnic cleansing or the Nakba in the 1947-1948. Also, after the occupation in the 1967 till the Intifada till now, they have continued the resistance. My grandfather and my father were jailed several times, like more than 1 million Palestinians imprisoned since 1967 by Israeli occupation. My generation was born during the Intifada under the curfews, home raids, and gas bombs. We have grown up with the horrors of occupation and siege. We have witnessed 3 massacres in the last 10 years. We have learned about the struggles of a prior generation of Palestinian resistance, and always remember the first generation of refugees who resisted during their entire lives and have never been allowed to return home. We young Palestinians continue the struggle that our ancestors launched. Today, BDS, with its international and intersectional character, has become one of the most effective tools of popular resistance in support of Palestinian rights. It enables us to cultivate hope and besiege the siege. Together, we can prevail. Thank you, and you can also check more information at bdsmovement.net and the US campaign website.
Thank you so much, Abdul Rahman. That was very inspiring. Please mute so we don't have feedback here. For helping see the way that we can channel our rage into BDS and the incredible power of BDS in this moment, contextualized in this larger history of Palestinian resistance. I wanted to mention that for those who are interested in continuing to learn about and get involved in BDS activism, be sure to check out the BNC's webpage, bdsmovement.net, which is in the chat field right now, as well as our BDS page, which is uscpr.org/BDS, which includes a brand new BDS toolkit and a short video series that outlines how to plan and carry out effective BDS campaigns. We just released them. They're incredibly useful, and we can chat in that link to the chat field. Another reminder that folks can ask questions to Abdul Rahman and Mazen and Nadia, the different speakers, using the Zoom system or in a Facebook comment if you're watching the live stream. I already see some coming in through the Q&A, so and they're being answered. So our final speaker is Nadia Hijab. Nadia is co-founder and executive director of Asharaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She's authored multiple books and was one of the founders of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. She was our co-chair of our steering committee and now serves on our advisory board. Welcome, Nadia. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Anna, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. I mean, I use the word pleasure advisedly because it's such a horrible time we live in. But I think the fact that we're all coming together and staying together in this fight, in this struggle, I think is just really, really vital. So I wanted to address the question of where we go from here. And I think the real challenge for Palestinians and for advocates of Palestinian rights is the here keeps moving back. It seems like, so that it seems like we have further to travel, and that we are in a much worse position than we were. But the most recent blow with Trump on Jerusalem is so outrageous, and also the fast pace at which his administration is moving to destroy or gut human environmental rights in the US and worldwide. With all of that happening, it's very easy to fall into despair. But I think we shouldn't fall into despair. We can't afford to, but also there's no need to, because it's at times like this that we must remember that there are many, many longer term trends that are working in the Palestinians' favor, in favor of human rights. And we can build on these to advance our common cause. Israel's conquest of the Palestinian and Arab territories in '67 is still very much a trap, despite its huge military, economic, and political power. You know, and back in 1967, Israel's victory was so quick and so massive, it could have had peace with the Arabs on its terms. And it could have had 78% of Palestine it had colonized in 1948 and bury the Palestinian cause forever. Instead, after '67, it continued on the track of the hardcore Zionists of the 20th century that were bent on colonization and dispossession to ensure a maximum number of Jews and a minimum number of Palestinians in Palestine. So based on their success, quote unquote, in erecting 200 illegal settlements, and illegally moving in 600,000 settlers with no repercussions, Israeli leaders are now determined to legalize their conquest. Sorry, and they say so blatantly. I mean, they no longer cloak their ambitions. It's all out there for anyone who wants to see it. But the settlement project, and here's the trap, has put Israel's quest to create a Jewish state into jeopardy. The terrible and worsening situation in the occupied territories has forced states and civil society to take account of what's happened to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is the original conquest by Israel, of course. So when you have even the former New York Times bureau chief, Jerusalem bureau chief, say, Jody Rudorin, when you have her say that the term apartheid is relevant. I mean, people have used the term apartheid to describe what's happening to the Palestinians under occupation. But Jody Rudorin goes ahead and says that the term apartheid is more relevant to the treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel. That means we're at a stage where the true nature of Israel's enterprise has percolated to the surface. The bottom line, it's not possible to have a state that privileges Jews without discriminating against non-Jews. And I think so that's one of the longer term trends in this conflict that's really working in our favor, in the favor of human rights. The other longer term trend is the change in the views of American Jews. As you know, as has been mentioned, JVP is leading and part of a significant shift, small but significant shift of Jews that are mobilizing to work for Palestinian human rights and all human rights. And what I think is really important, apart from JVP being a very strategic and very organized organization and moving forward very fast, is that it has adopted Palestinian rights as goals, the rights as defined by the Palestinians themselves in the BDS call. So I think that's really significant, and that small percentage of Jews is growing. But there's also a larger and more recent shift in the US Jewish community because of the growing tensions between Israel and the Reform and conservative Jews, who account for about 2/3 of US Jews and who tend to be more progressive. Effectively, Israel is now treating them like second-class Jews. There's apparently a blacklist of about 160 rabbis, US rabbis, whose marriages and conversions are not recognized by the Orthodox rabbis who control that recognition, within Israel, who have the say-so as to who, effectively the say-so as to who is a Jew. And that's creating a lot of tension between a large part of Jews and Israel, which is percolating to the surface. And apparently Israel is pinning its hopes on the much more conservative but smaller Orthodox Jewish community in the US who still support Israel, right or wrong. I consider this a strategic mistake on Israel's part because it's alienating a very important constituency that contributes hugely to the discourse and the political development in the US and also the philanthropy of the US. And so by doing this, Israel is, I think, fast-tracking shifts in the US that will end the automatic political and military aid that Israel receives over time and enable mainstream support for Palestinian rights. Another long-term trend, as Mazen has mentioned, is that the Palestinian struggle for rights regenerates, and as Abdurrahman has mentioned, the Palestinian struggle for rights regenerates in different forms every 15 or 20 years, despite the crushing defeats that have been imposed by colonial, the British to begin with, Israeli and Arab powers. And even the international solidarity movement regenerates after having dissipated, for example, after Oslo, the huge global civil society solidarity movement of the 70s and 80s dissipated because people thought peace was at hand. And as Abdurrahman has mentioned and spoken to, that solidarity movement has now regenerated. Since the year 2000, in fact, it began to reform. And since 2005, it has included and been reinforced and been led effectively by the Palestinian led BDS movement. And for the past 5 years, Israel and its supporters have thrown their full weight against this movement in an effort to reclaim the high ground and to control the discourse on Palestine and Israel. But the movement is still alive and kicking. So now against that background, where do we go from here? And what are our options? What should we be doing? And I'm just going to list a few things. I mean, there's much more to say, but we have a limited amount of time. First, I think it's very important, as Mazen said, we have to keep a very watchful eye on the political front. Israel is going to be speeding up the dispossession and displacement of Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem, using both the bureaucratic techniques it's perfected over the years, and a lot has been written about that. And you can find some of that on Al-Shabaka, the organization I co-founded, as Anna said, and direct at the moment. It's also using the bulldozer and the wrecking ball to dispossess Palestinians. And the greatest fear is for Jerusalem itself, both the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa compound. And so we really need to keep the light shining on this and sound the alarm as needed. We also need to find a way to call on the UN to provide international protection to the Palestinian people, which the UN should be empowered to do, backed by a consistent strategy to secure such protection. We should also keep informed of and keep the light shining on the plots by the so-called Arab Quartet that's made up of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. They're really pushing the US-Israeli annexation plan, and we have to be very vigilant and well-informed to push back. At the same time, we must keep abreast of the moves on the Palestinian political front. And to understand the extent of the pressures on the Palestinian leadership, if Abbas rejects the peace deal, he'll lose a lot of aid, without which civil servants can't be paid, which will affect something like 1.5 million people in the occupied territories. If he bows before it, he will be forced to sign away Palestinian rights. And I'm not defending, the Palestinian leadership has made lots and lots of mistakes. I'm just describing a reality that is faced. In the wings stands Abbas's arch enemy and former Palestinian security chief, Mohammed Dahlan, who is the protege of the Emirates. And he's waiting there. If Abbas should die or he's got rid of or deposed, then somebody else like Dahlan will come who is prepared to sign. who would be prepared to sign. There are also rumors that Israel and the US plan to transfer Gaza's Palestinians to the Egyptian Sinai desert, far away from the borders of their original homeland, as part of this big plan, this big deal. So we just need to keep a watchful eye on that and stay informed. We also must do everything we can to promote intra-Palestinian reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. This is not only important, many of the things I'm saying apply primarily to Palestinians, but also to the solidarity movement. So this reconciliation is not only important in itself to reunify or bring back together at least the Palestinian political system, weak and as it is, but it's also important because that way the Palestinians will be better able to pull together diverse support from Arab and Asian states, some of which are closer to one party like Fatah than to the other, Hamas, and vice versa. So every political connection to strengthen the Palestinian position must be tapped. We must also find and push for ways to phase out and somehow end the PA security coordination with Israel, which is devastating for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. This will be very hard, but there's a lot of research been done on the subject that may be able to guide the way to scale back this coordination. Then moving on to Palestinian society in the global solidarity movement, I see we have some people from Europe that have joined this call. And I want to highlight the role of Europe in this struggle, and the European countries of this struggle. So far, European countries have given Israel an easy ride, and the measures they've taken, like labeling settlement products, are ultimately ineffectual. The reason I emphasize Europe is because Europe needs international law. They can't afford to have it ripped up just like that, like the US is doing to international law. Because for Europeans, the system of international law, that's been erected since World War II, is their protection against other devastating wars that happened on their continent. So they have a vested interest in protecting international law. And here's the thing. To legalize the occupation, Israel will have to undermine, and has been undermining, that entire legal framework that has protected the world from global war. And the EU and the majority of its member states can never sign off on Israel's occupation, in part to protect international law. So as civil society, we need to push Palestinian representatives to take advantage of the Europeans' rejection of Trump's recognition of Jerusalem and the planned deal that's happening and these policies. And we need to really push the Palestinian political representatives to embark on an extensive public relations and a campaign of pressure on European governments and diplomats. Now, in the US, the solidarity movement has made really good, impressive inroads into the political system, especially in the Democratic Party. And we say really good because of the very, very low base that we're coming from. It has taken 20 years at least and more of education and activism to shift the discourse, begin to shift the discourse in our favor and make those inroads. So I think we have a lot to be happy about and proud of. And together with the solidarity movement in Europe, as well as in Latin America, we can offer not just pressure on the Palestinian leadership, but also support if there are coordinated actions to reach out to government. Because, for example, in the US, the Palestine Solidarity Movement has several strong institutions that can advance Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices in the media, provide legal support, advocate for Palestinian rights, and pull in increasing number of Jews. And this movement can really serve as a bulwark of support as we make that push against for to change positions of governments and parliaments. So, and I want to say that the U.S. movement is ahead of building building institutions than other countries around the world. Which is great. There's strong institutions, some strong institutions in Britain and some in Europe, obviously, but the US movement is well ahead. And I want to urge us all to support and strengthen these institutions. You know who they are better than I do. There's the US campaign, obviously. There's JVP, there's Palestine Legal, there's the churches doing, and we need these institutions because they will carry us through. Volunteer work is wonderful, but it's not enough. And speaking of institutions, I really want to encourage you all to sign up for Al-Shabaka's email list, because you can get authentic Palestinian voices providing analysis of what's going on the Palestinian scene. And you can find that on al-shabaka.org, al-shabaka.org. So I wanted to say one quick thing about the brief discussion that Mazen sparked, and I think I saw a couple of questions on the chat, which is about the one-state solution. As a movement, I think it would be strategic on our part to remain agnostic about what the political outcome should be, because Israel, there's not enough time to go into this now, but Israel's occupation is its Achilles heel. I wrote a piece about this, which was published by Al-Shabaka, because that's where really international law is a tool that we can use. So while individually we may support one state or two states, let's remain agnostic. The BDS movement does not speak of a political solution, and that's very smart. And other organizations do not speak of political. We are miles away from a political solution. What we need to do is strengthen our power and use the tools that we have available. And international law is one of those key tools, and it applies very much to the occupation. So just to sum up, in conclusion, our role as a Palestinian and as global civil society is to maintain the pressure on Israel, to push back against its attempts to control the discourse, to push back against the attempts to wrap this whole conflict up and impose a solution, and to pressure the Palestinian leadership to stay on the straight and narrow, and also to reinforce the capacity not to do a deal. And I think by thinking through these issues, these and other issues, and by developing strategies, we can turn this latest tragedy that Trump is trying to impose on us, we can turn this tragedy into an opportunity. I'll stop there and available for questions.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for, as always, helping contextualize the present moment in this broader context, providing cutting edge analysis. I do hope people sign up for the Al-Shabaka email list, and helping see this current moment in its possibility, as in addition to the obvious devastating unfolding. So we are basically out of time here. I've seen a lot of good questions coming through that are being answered by the panelists, and don't want to take too much more time from people, but I do really want to thank all of our speakers for their really inspiring and insightful presentations. And this video will be posted on the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights website, and is part of a larger curriculum we've developed throughout this year. It's called Together We Rise, Palestine as a Model of Resistance, which coincides with several significant anniversaries this year, including 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 70 years since the UN recommended the partition of Palestine, 50 years of Israel's military occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and 10 years at least of Israel's siege of Gaza, all of which have triggered fierce Palestinian resistance that we've heard about today. So please check out our curriculum at uscpr.org/Together We Rise for extensive resources about Palestine, tools to build your advocacy skills, and information and analysis about the connections between racism and colonization from the US to Palestine, as some of our speakers mentioned. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.